Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Fundamental Fridays. I'm Josh Ash. I'm going to be your host for this week's episode. It's been a long time since I've gotten to do one of these, but I'm excited to be back to it, especially because we are talking about silhouette design. Now, silhouette design is a fundamental skill that we all need in our tool bag, and it really influences every aspect of design and good picture making. All right, so we got a lot to talk about today, so let's jump straight over to it. All right, so we're going to start off really general with an overview of what is silhouette design, what areas of design does it affect, how it can positively impact our image making skills, and I'm going to show you what parts of my artistic process I incorporate silhouette design into, and what I think the anatomy of a good silhouette is. And then after that, I have a demo to show you guys how I did these exercises here, and it's going to be a really good exercise for you guys to incorporate into your studies to start getting you down the path of making great silhouettes. So it's going to be great if you have no experience to intermediate experience with silhouettes. So what is a silhouette design? Well, it's the arrangement of the two most vital parts of a painting, shapes and values, into easily understandable and readable formations. So you can see here on the left, I have a bunch of characters and vehicles and creatures from movies and video games and stuff like that. And I've taken away all of their color information and all of their interior detail information, and all that's left is their silhouette. Just based on the silhouette, I bet you guys can still recognize them, and you'd be able to recognize them from a long ways away. And that's really the power of designing with silhouettes, that you can take away so much information and the viewer still knows what they're looking at. Now, silhouette design is a part of every one of the individual niches within design, whether it's characters or creatures, props, vehicles, or environments. And then if we combine all this together, then we get keyframes and illustrations. And this is going to be a really vital skill that we can break down complex imagery into nice, simplified, flat, graphic shapes. It's going to help us maintain readability in even the most complicated of briefs with multiple characters doing multiple different actions. It's going to help us maintain that clarity. So you may be wondering, what part of the pipeline should you use silhouette design in if it's such a foundational aspect to all these different avenues of design? And everybody's process is a little bit differently, so you definitely want to experiment to find your own. But for me, I really like to sprinkle silhouettes throughout the whole design process. So I use it in the beginning stages, like you can see here, all the way when I'm, making the final marks on a painting to make sure all my shapes are reading correctly. So in the case of these sketches, I knew I wanted to do a Cyclops creature design that was kind of a hulking guy that looks like he could tank a bunch of damage and really pose a problem for our hero character for a video game. And the great thing about this is it isolates the big picture problems that you need to solve early in a design. So there's no color information that I can get lost in. There's no real detail that I can get lost in. I'm just focusing on the big feeling of the creature, the overall shape language, the proportion, and I'm figuring that stuff out first. So because they're just silhouettes, there's no detail, no color, each one of these is just like a minute or two each, so you can do a whole page of explorations very, very quickly and burn through a lot of ideas to find really cool ideas. And then of course you can push them further by turning them into nicer drawings, as you can see here. And the drawings are typically going to be more successful because the big shapes are already there. So it's kind of just a stress-free drawing process from here. And then you can, of course, push them to finals, like you can see here on this work in progress that I have here of this shaman type Cyclops. Okay, and then this is the other way that I use silhouettes, and it's to kind of check my work before moving forwards. So I have this sketch here that I did traditionally of this landscape and a little character, and I could have just taken a picture like I did, brought it into Photoshop, done a drawing over top to clarify some of the elements, and then painted it. But I wanted to block it into values to see if the big planes of like foreground, midground, background were working, if the character was reading up against the background, if the story was coming through. And so I just really quickly blocked it in like this. These weren't going to be necessarily representative of the light or the final values or anything like that. But I wanted to see what it would feel like if the story would come through, if the character would pop enough. And I think some areas were okay and I could see potential, but certainly they needed to be kind of pushed and pulled a little bit. Unfortunately, right now, there's really no story. It's a character looking off into the distance, and that's been done a million times. and it's probably going to be done a million times more. So I wanted to stay away from that and add a little bit more to it. And I knew this character was going to be a little mailman, and that I wanted to show him kind of struggling through his job and having some, some funny mishaps along the way. And so I pushed it to this silhouette. And you can see I've kind of pushed the contrast a little bit more. I've totally changed the pose. And there's hopefully a lot more dynamics here that makes it a lot more interesting. You can see before the silhouette is there, but barely noticeable. Here, it's a lot more evident what to look at. And then that's how I got my finished painting for this. If I hadn't have just taken the time to block it in and ask some questions, I think it would have been much less of a successful image. So in this example, I have this illustration that I've been doing for the Toad Boat project that I have, and I was wanting to illustrate their little outhouse that they pull behind the boat. It's a really ridiculous story, really, really absurd. But I got to a certain point in it where I'm like, okay, I think this is pretty much done, but I wanted to always take a minute, take a break, and try to find areas that I can make better and to see if I can clarify the image a little bit more. And I felt like some of the stuff in here was getting lost. Kind of the midground and the foreground were kind of melding together a little bit, and it was kind of muddying up the image and the shapes. So originally I had a drawing and I put silhouettes over the top to try to figure out my big, medium, and small proportions. So I thought, well, I'll bring that back in to kind of remind myself of the original intent of the image. And so I just laid it right over top. And I remembered it's all about this outhouse. I want to have indication of the boat. There's some storytelling on the boat, but it's all about the outhouse. And right now that silhouette is getting lost, especially zooming out, and most people are going to be looking at it very small anyway, so I need to make sure it really pops. So I upped the brightness a little bit so it would give it a little bit more room to breathe, and then just added some atmospheric perspective to push the line work and the colors in the background back, and then my foreground outhouse, it pushes it way forward now. And I think overall this is a way more successful image, and you can really see that silhouette shape of the outhouse from much further away. So what is the anatomy of a good silhouette design? Well, I think it comes down to these 4 elements, and that's big, medium, and small, rest and noise, shape language, and story. So the first one being big, medium, and small. And by that, I mean I want to have good balances of big shapes, medium shapes, and small shapes within both my positive and negative areas of my design. By positive and negative, I mean the black areas of the silhouette, so the actual character or creature, that's the positive area of the silhouette. And then the negative is the spaces in between. So these hollowed out spaces here in the bends of the arms that I have between the legs, the shape that is made over here by the hand and the weapon, that's the negative areas, as well as the white areas on the outside. Rest and noise. So I want to have areas where there's more detail and more visual interest, and I want to have areas where my eye can rest and it's not busy, it's not noisy. So these areas down below here, I have it fairly simple. And then as the design moves up, I'm adding more and more detail, especially around the head and weapon of the design. And then shape language, I want to have a consistent shape language throughout. So you can see I have a lot of kind of round shapes that are kind of squared off in places. And then in a few choice spots, I have small triangular shapes. So on the arrows sticking out of him and the horn on the side of his head, as well as some squared off triangles on the weapon. And then story. So this one's a little bit more complicated, and I've kind of broken it down here. The silhouette should communicate the needs of the brief in regards to story and technical constraints. So for this, I just made myself a brief. And it was really simple. I just wanted a Cyclops that was a brute enemy character in a video game. I wanted him to look imposing, and I wanted to look like he could tank a lot of damage and dish out a lot of damage. So if he hits you, it's going to take out a lot of your health bar. And I think that's coming through in the pose. You know, I didn't want a weak looking character for this brief. I needed him to be big looking, imposing looking. Obviously the weapon is helping a lot in him feeling like he could really hit your video game character. And then a small little nod to the fact that he could tank some damage. I have arrows sticking out of him already. Okay, and here's an example of if I was to totally disregard big, medium, and small, rest and noise, and shape language, and it just becomes chaos. Now the weapon is essentially the same size as the character. There's triangles everywhere. There's circles everywhere. You know, the arrows are getting lost and whatever else is sticking out of him. And it's just becoming too noisy. Your eye doesn't exactly know where to go at this point. If you used to zoom out, you can't really tell what's going on very easily. Our focus should be on clarity and being able to tell what something is very quickly. And this is losing all of that. Okay, so let's talk for a second about making yourself a concept brief that's going to help you to introduce story into your designs. So these designs are beautiful and great and so well balanced in their big, medium, and small shapes and their shape language, and they have nice areas of rest and areas of noise that draw our eye in. But these designs were not made in a vacuum that then a story and a whole world was built off of most of the time. Usually when you're working professionally, you start off with a brief that has technical constraints, it has story constraints, and design constraints. And within those constraints is where great design really comes out of. So how do we make a concept brief for ourselves so we can start practicing how to work professionally? It's actually a lot more straightforward than you might imagine and a really fun process. This is the process that I use to make myself briefs, and it's all about starting general and then working to a few specifics. So I like to start off with my deliverables. What things do I want to create? Let's say I want to create a character design and I want to create an environment design and a prop sheet to go with it. That's a good start. Let's get a little bit more specific. I want the character to be a mechanic. I want the environment to be his machine shop, and I want the props to be the tools that he uses. And then I answer the question of what is this for? What's the product? Is this a board game? Is this a video game? Is this a movie? In this case, let's say it's going to be for a video game. And I want to get more specific than that. I want to answer, is it a top-down strategy game? Is it a side-scrolling platformer? Is it a first-person shooter? Let's figure that out because each one of those has different design constraints. And then I ask who, what, when, where, why, and how in regards to the character, environment, and the prop. And that's going to help me get a lot more life into my project. So for example, let's answer a few questions about who this mechanic is. Is he somebody who loves this job, who's very good at it, he's very experienced, maybe he's an old guy, and he's just the best around at his job, versus he's a young guy that hates his job and is just dragging his feet into work every single day. Those two things are very opposing, and it should come through in the silhouette. What does he work on? Does he work on mechs? Does he work on motorcycles? Does he work on tanks or cars? Each of those things is going to have different tools that he would have to use for him. There's different materials. The environment that he works in is going to need to be different based on the size of what he's working on. When is this occurring? Is it in the 1920s, the 1960s, current day? And then where is this happening at? Is it in America, Europe, Asia, Africa? If we can narrow those things down, it's going to help us narrow down what reference we need to gather. It's going to determine architecture styles, material styles, patterns, and colors. Why is he working on, say, mechs? Maybe there's a war going on and he has to build these mechs. Because in this alternate reality, instead of inventing tanks, they invented mechs instead to go into battle. How is he working on this? Is he pulling stuff from a scrapyard, or is this highly refined machined metal plates and panels that are specifically designed for mechs? So you can see, if we just take a couple minutes, get ourselves some guidelines going in a brief, that's going to help introduce a lot more interesting design constraints. It's going to help you determine what kind of references you need to gather, and it's going to get you off to designing cool things a lot faster. So building a brief is not only really fun, it's one of the most important parts of the process if you want to have good, consistent work. So if you've never worked on silhouettes, or you have very little experience working with silhouettes and that kind of thinking, a great place to start is to actually just break down photos into basic silhouettes. So you can see here, I've taken this head sculpture and I've done a study a few different ways and just broken it down into basic shapes. In the first approach, I'm being very object or layer focused. So the sculpt is one shape, and then the background is its own shape, and then the table is its own shape, almost like paper cutouts. And then the next approach that I'm taking is to be light and shadow focused, where I'm just trying to represent the abstract shapes that the shadows are making when they fall on the form, and how they come together to still read as, in this case, a face or a head. And this is going to help us really learn how to design our shapes and to be a little bit more sensitive to what shapes are indicating what. And then we can really start to wield that in our own designs as we get used to this. So here's kind of the guidelines. To start, you're only going to use two values, black and white, and it needs to be just a simple brush, no crazy texture or anything like that. And make sure it has a hard edge, or you can use the lasso tool. Make sure there's no opacity jitter and set a time limit for these. You don't need to be spending an hour or anywhere close to that on these. You can spend anywhere from a minute to like 10 minutes at most. It really doesn't need to be more than that. And another fun way to do this is to work traditionally with a Sharpie or a brush pen. That's always a lot of fun. Once you get used to doing two values, move on to three values. So you have a 50% gray thrown in, and then you can move on to four values where you have a dark gray and a light gray thrown in. Okay, and here we have a demo, and I am just going to use two values for this one, and I'm focusing on light and shadow this time. So I could have just done the overall big shape and the background, but I thought the light and shadow was really interesting on this, and I wanted to see if I could represent that. And now this is a pretty simple photo. I think it's important that you start off simple and work towards complexity, because we don't want to set ourselves up for a big challenge and then failure. That's going to demoralize us. We want to try to set ourselves up for success. That's going to keep you going a lot longer. So if you have trouble figuring out like your big shapes, your light and dark masses, if you squint down at the image, a lot of that detail will kind of merge together, and what you can still see is the really big important shape. So as you're working on these, squint down. If you can't see it when you squint, it's not as important as the things that you can see when you squint. Now, I'm studying from photos, but you could also go out into the real world and do this. I've done that too. It's just, harder for me to record that, but that's a lot of fun to do. You can get your ideas and compositions down very quickly that way. But other things that you can study from are photos of sculptures. Like you saw, I did that sculpture of the head earlier in this video on that slide. You saw those. You can also study from the old masters. Take your favorite landscape paintings or portraiture and see how they break down those forms. And just use a few values. And again, hard edges, even if it's full of soft edges in that painting, you have to decide where do you cut those edges off. And that's a great way to learn about how they compose their images. You can also do movie stills. That's a great way to learn about how to compose cinematically. And it's really interesting to see how simple the compositions are in that, because they're only on screen for a few seconds and they really have to be clear in what is going on in that scene. And then you can also set up still lifes for yourself and then set up a lighting scenario and do a study from it and then move that light and to see how that changes. That's a great way to study as well. So you can see here I have a slightly more complicated scene that has bounce light and it has a character in it. And especially with that bounce light, I have to make decisions of, do I present that in just the blacks? Because I'm losing a lot of information that way, but it doesn't really make sense to present it in the lights because it is in the shadow family. And you can see I kind of compromised in this, and I presented the back of the alley as the whites, even though that is just bounce light back there. But I thought it was a nice shape to have and to kind of add a little bit more depth into this flat image. And I'm really deciding, do I add more small shapes in there? Because I have big shapes, I have some mediums. Do I need more smalls? And it's kind of a balancing act, because I don't want to add too much and then it becomes noisy and chaotic. So you can see I bring some stuff in and then I take it away. I simplify some areas. And, there's no really right or wrong, which makes this both fun and frustrating, because I can't just look at the answer book, right? I have to kind of get a feeling for, is this too busy? Does it not have enough? All right, and then in this one, I spent a little bit more time on this one because I kind of was just having fun and I didn't realize how much time I was spending. You can see I started off blocking in the whole form and making sure the proportion was right, and then I'm going to end up cutting into it with the other values. I end up using 4 on this one. And something that I'm sure you're going to notice as you try doing some with 2 values versus 3 values versus 4 is that sometimes it's, you're making really tough decisions always, but especially when you just have black and white to work with. So much detail has to be lost in those midtones that you could have put in if you had a few more values to work with. But when you have more values to work with, then you have more shapes to have to design and sculpt into. So it's really a kind of an interesting play between all those different factors. But that is really what design is all about, is you're just making decision after decision after decision, and some problems that you solve cause other problems that you have to solve later on down the road. So this is a great practice to, have a reference image up like this and have to make bold decisions about how to represent it. It's a fairly straightforward image. There's no color. It's really clear light and shadow, but there's a lot of soft transitions on this that I have to make decisions about. Where exactly does the light and shadow, where exactly do I want the light and shadow to cut in on the cheek? How many shapes do I want to have on certain areas of the face to represent it? I'm trying to balance that idea of having areas of rest and areas of noise. So in the eyes, I want there to be some more shapes, but I still want it to maintain its clarity. But I want more shapes in there so it draws the eye in a little bit. And I want it to be surrounded by, flatter, simpler shapes on the upper cheek and the forehead there. But it's always a balancing act of, am I describing enough? Am I adding too much? And that is just really what design is all about. This is going to help develop your sensitivity to shapes and forms so much by doing these studies. And this isn't something where you have to sit down and decide, okay, I'm going to spend the next 6 months just doing silhouette studies. You might learn from that, but I think that's a bit excessive. You can do a few of these here and there and then try to incorporate what you're learning into your own projects that you're bringing from start to finish. And then notice the areas that you're kind of falling short on. Do a few more studies. Try to hone in on that. Have a goal when you're doing studies. That's always good. But you want to be balanced in how much you're studying versus how much you're really producing of your own ideas. You don't want to just study and you don't want to just produce your own ideas. You want to have a balance there. But for me, I always like to do a little bit of study and then try to incorporate what I learn immediately into my own personal project. All right, and then there is the final study for this one. You can see here I tried to be very clear with my shapes. I tried to have areas of rest and noise. I wanted big, medium, and small shapes in there. And I had to make a lot of decisions about where shadows start and stop. And if they're cut in a little bit sooner or later, what does that do to the form? And this is just going to be a great exercise for you guys to get started down the path to making great silhouettes, great shapes, and great designs. All right, and with that, we're going to wrap up. I really appreciate you guys tuning into this week's episode. Remember, there's a bunch of other Fundamental Friday videos on this channel, so go check those out. And if there's a topic that we haven't covered yet that you'd like to see, make sure you put it down in the comments below. And again, a big thanks to Tyler for having me on his channel again. I always have a lot of fun making these videos. And go check out the Patreon as well as the Brush Sauce Academy website, where Tyler has information for group mentorships, one-on-one mentorships, classes, lots of great resources over there that you don't want to miss out on. All right, I really appreciate it, guys. I'll see you on the next one.